Do you know that right next to one of the most expensive coastlines on Earth, where tens of millions of people are packed into every square meter, there is an archipelago that is almost completely deserted? Just a few dozen kilometers off the coast of Southern California, where real estate can cost tens of millions of dollars for a single ocean view home, there are 8 islands with a perfect Mediterranean climate, crystal clear water, and rolling hills. Yet they are almost completely empty. So the question is, why has one of the hottest real estate markets in America never swallowed up these 8 islands sitting right in front of it? To answer that question, we first need to understand what this archipelago really is, because this is not an ordinary chain of islands. On the map, these 8 islands stretch for about 100 kilometers along the coast, from north of Santa Barbara down toward San Diego. They lie within a special curve of the coastline that geographers call the Southern California Bight, where the cold current from Alaska meets warmer water from the equator. This creates an isolated climate, very different from the rest of California, with fog and unpredictable weather throughout the year. But even stranger than their location is the fact that these 8 islands are actually very different from one another. Look closely, and you'll see they are divided into 2 completely different groups, almost belonging to 2 separate geological worlds. The northern group forms an almost straight line, visible from the Santa Barbara coastline on clear days. One island is so large that it has an entire central valley, a geological fault, in 2 separate mountain ranges. Another looks nothing like an island at all, consisting only of steep volcanic cliffs with not a drop of fresh water. And at the far edge, one island takes the full force of the Pacific, with strong winds and thick fog year-round. The southern group is completely different. They are scattered across the ocean, separated by deep underwater canyons. One of them lies more than 90 kilometers from the mainland, so isolated that it almost feels like another world. And this is the part that leaves geologists stunned. The 2 island groups are not only different in shape, but they were also born in completely different ways. The northern group is the result of an incredibly violent collision. Millions of years ago, when the Pacific Plate collided with the North American Plate, the enormous friction did more than push the land upward. It also rotated an entire block of Earth's crust by 90 degrees, tore it away from the mainland, and submerged part of it beneath the sea. What we see today is only the peak of a mountain range that was pushed underwater. The southern group, however, was born in a completely different way, from volcanic activity and slow geological uplift lasting millions of years, rising straight from the ocean floor rather than breaking away from the mainland. Because they were never connected to the continent, even during the Ice Age when sea levels were at their lowest, these islands became completely isolated laboratories of evolution. There was once a fox here as large as the gray foxes on the mainland, but after thousands of years living on the islands, it shrank to the size of a house cat to survive with limited food. People call this place the Galapagos of North America. But the same isolation that created such strange evolutionary species also made the islands almost impossible for humans to conquer. Steep cliffs, no fresh water, dangerous currents, it seemed like an impenetrable fortress. Yet humans still made it here, and they arrived earlier than almost anywhere else in the Americas. In 1959, when archaeologists were excavating a canyon on one of the northern islands, they discovered a human skeleton dating back around 13,000 years, one of the oldest human remains ever found in North America. The discovery overturned the previous theory that the first humans arrived in the Americas only by walking across a land bridge and then moving south. In reality, they had boats, and they had been traveling along the Pacific coast thousands of years ago. 2 indigenous tribes called these islands home, one living on the windy northern islands and the other on the warmer southern group. They did not turn away from the ocean like many agricultural civilizations did. They faced directly toward the sea. They built wooden plank canoes from redwood trees that had drifted down from the north, then used natural asphalt seeping from the ocean floor to bind the planks together. With these boats, they hunted large marine animals, fished in kelp forests, and built a thriving trading network that lasted for more than 10,000 years. But a sustainable ocean civilization like this was almost wiped out within just a few generations when ships from across the ocean arrived. Europeans brought diseases, and then the mission system forced indigenous people to leave the islands for the mainland. By the 1830s, the archipelago was completely empty of people, and this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Those empty islands did not stay quiet for long. They were soon overrun, not by people, but by tens of thousands of livestock. New settlers looked at the empty grassy hills and saw the perfect grazing land. Sheep, cattle, and pigs were brought to the islands in huge numbers, and with no natural predators, they multiplied out of control, destroying the vegetation that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. But one island took a completely different path, and this island raises an important question. If one island could become a resort paradise, why couldn't the other seven? This island had a naturally sheltered deep-water harbor, something no other island in the archipelago possessed. Throughout the 19th century, the harbor became an ideal refuge for smugglers and pirates. But in 1919, a wealthy Chicago chewing gum magnate bought most of the island, and he didn't see a sheep ranch. He saw a Mediterranean paradise. He spent millions building a town around the harbor, creating a huge circular casino building that still dominates the waterfront today, and even brought his own baseball team to the island for spring training. Hollywood stars followed, and that small town became the only officially established city in the entire archipelago. So if a man with enough money could turn a deserted island into a luxury paradise, why didn't real estate developers do the same with the other 7 islands? Los Angeles was booming in population, and investors were always hungry for new land. So what stopped them? The first answer didn't come from environmentalists, but from the military. When World War II threatened the Pacific coast, the federal government realized it had an almost completely undefended coastline. 2 of the southern islands were immediately taken over, ranchers were forced to leave, radar systems were installed, and bombing ranges began operating. To this day, one of those islands remains the only surviving U.S. Navy range where warships directly fire shells onto land, and both islands still contain unexploded bombs scattered across them. And what about the northern islands? They sat right in front of Santa Barbara, seemingly just waiting to be turned into resorts. But for more than a century, they were tightly controlled by a few wealthy ranching families who treated the entire islands like private farms and had no intention of selling to anyone. Even if they had wanted to sell, a massive engineering problem was waiting. There was no sheltered deep-water harbor like the other island, only steep cliffs, huge waves, and strong winds, along with almost no fresh water to support a large community. Pumping water from the mainland through underwater pipelines was simply far too expensive for decades. But by the 1960s and 1970s, that equation began to change. Coastal California real estate prices skyrocketed to the point where the cost of building infrastructure on the islands no longer sounded completely insane. Developers began drawing plans for resorts, private airports, and luxury villas. Los Angeles's urbanization machine was finally turning its attention toward the last remaining islands. But just as the bulldozers were preparing to start, a last-minute intervention stopped everything. The environmental movement of the 1970s exploded across California. Scientists warned that if the islands were developed, this unique ecosystem, known as the Galapagos of North America, would disappear forever. In a breathtaking race against the real estate market, conservation groups bought the land piece by piece, and by 1980, most of the northern islands officially became a protected national park. So the military and conservationists saved 7 of the islands. But what about the island with the town, the casino, and the chewing gum magnates' money? Why didn't it develop into a high-rise city like other famous resort islands around the world? The answer lies in its geography. The town is squeezed into a narrow canyon, surrounded by steep mountains, with almost no room left to build. And even more seriously, the island suffers from a severe lack of fresh water, relying entirely on a small reservoir and a desalination plant operating at full capacity. Whenever California faces a drought, residents here have to live under strict water restrictions. But the final and most decisive blow came from the very family that created the town. In 1972, instead of selling the remaining land to developers, they did the exact opposite. They donated 88% of the island's land to a nonprofit organization, permanently locking that land away from any possibility of development. And that is how one of the most valuable stretches of coastline in America remains almost completely undeveloped to this day. Not because nobody wanted to build there, but because of a chain of overlapping limitations. A block of rock rotated 90 degrees millions of years ago, a world war, stubborn ranching families who refused to sell, environmental activists racing against time, and a land donation that could have become billions of dollars in real estate. On the map, they are just 8 tiny dots off the coast of California. But after millions of years of geological history and several centuries of human history, perhaps what has kept these islands intact is not the power of humans, but the very limits that humans, no matter how wealthy, simply cannot overcome. If you could build anything on these islands, Would you turn them into a paradise or leave them exactly as they are? Let us know in the comments below.